There comes a moment in the journey of awakening when the very foundation of your existence begins to crumble, not through external catastrophe, but through the slow, inexorable dissolution of everything you once believed gave life meaning. You wake up one morning and the coffee tastes like nothing. The news feels like a poorly written script designed to keep minds trapped in artificial urgency. Your relationships seem like elaborate performances where everyone has forgotten they are acting. And even your own reflection in the mirror appears to be that of a stranger wearing a mask you no longer recognize or remember putting on. This is not depression in the clinical sense, though it may masquerade as such to those who observe from the outside. This is the profound disorientation that occurs when consciousness begins to see through the carefully constructed illusions that once provided the entire scaffolding for what you called your life, your identity, your purpose. If you have found yourself in this strange territory where existence itself feels hollow, where the very act of being seems pointless, where you question not just what you are doing, but why you are doing anything at all, where even the concept of having goals feels absurd, know that you are not losing your mind. You are losing your illusions, and there is perhaps no more terrifying or necessary passage in the entire spectrum of human experience. The dissolution of meaning is like watching a magnificent theater production from backstage while the show is still running, except you suddenly realize you have been both an actor and an audience member simultaneously without ever knowing it. You see the actors applying their makeup with desperate precision, the stagehands frantically moving sets that are revealed to be painted cardboard, the director frantically coordinating chaos while pretending it is order, and suddenly the magic that once captivated you from the audience is replaced by the stark reality of artifice, manipulation, and collective agreement to pretend that temporary constructions are permanent truths. The romance, the drama, the comedy, the tragedy that once seemed so real and engaging now appear as nothing more than elaborate constructions designed to keep consciousness entertained, distracted, and most importantly, asleep to the vast mystery that exists behind every curtain, beyond every story, beneath every identity. This is what happens when consciousness begins to awaken from the dream of conventional reality. The stories that once animated your existence with such convincing force, the goals that once pulled you forward with magnetic certainty, the identities that once defined the boundaries of who you thought you were, all begin to reveal their fundamentally constructed, arbitrary, and ultimately temporary nature. And in that revelation, there can be a profound sense of meaninglessness that feels like a kind of spiritual death, a dissolution so complete that you begin to wonder if there is anything real left at all. The ancient mystics spoke of this experience as the dark night of the soul, that necessary passage through what appears to be meaninglessness before arriving at a meaning so vast and encompassing that it transcends all previous understanding while simultaneously containing it all. But in the midst of this passage, when you are neither who you were nor who you are becoming, when the old motivations have died but new ones have not yet emerged, when you exist in a kind of existential limbo between worlds, there can be a terrifying suspension in what feels like an infinite void. You look at your life, at all human life, at the entire project of civilization itself, and it can seem like an elaborate game of make-believe that has forgotten it is make-believe, a collective hallucination so convincing that even its participants have lost awareness of its constructed nature. The pursuit of success begins to feel like running toward a mirage that recedes with every step. The accumulation of possessions reveals itself as an attempt to fill an unfillable void with objects that themselves are void of inherent meaning. The formation of relationships can suddenly appear as elaborate contracts between isolated consciousnesses trying to escape their fundamental aloneness through temporary mergers that inevitably dissolve. The construction of legacy, the attempt to create something that will outlast the body, can seem like nothing more than sophisticated denial of the ultimate impermanence that governs all phenomena. This dissolution of the will to live in its conventional sense is not a pathology to be corrected with medication or therapy or positive thinking, but a necessary shedding that precedes a more authentic, more profound, more sustainable engagement with existence itself. It is the ego's death rattle, the last desperate attempts of a constructed self to maintain its relevance in the face of a consciousness that is beginning to recognize its true nature as something far vaster and more mysterious than any identity could contain. The person you thought you were, with all their carefully cultivated desires, hard-won ambitions, deeply felt fears, and driving motivations, is revealed to be a kind of elaborate costume that consciousness has been wearing, perhaps for decades, perhaps for lifetimes. And when that costume begins to feel too tight, too artificial, Too removed from what you are beginning to sense is your authentic nature, when it starts to chafe against the expanding awareness that no longer fits within its confines. The very foundations of what motivated that costume begin to crumble like a sandcastle before an incoming tide. The career that once seemed so important, that once provided not just financial security but fundamental identity, suddenly feels like playing a role in someone else's play, following a script you never consciously agreed to memorize. The relationships that once provided meaning through connection and shared experience can begin to feel like elaborate negotiations between unconscious patterns rather than authentic encounters between conscious beings. The goals that once created direction and motivation, that once pulled you forward with such magnetic force, can suddenly feel like arbitrary destinations someone else chose for you before you were old enough to choose for yourself. All of these can suddenly feel like remnants of someone else's life, artifacts from a previous incarnation, belongings of a person who no longer exists, and perhaps never truly existed in the first place. But there is something even more disturbing than the collapse of external meaning structures. There is the recognition that the self who found meaning in these structures was itself a construction, a collection of borrowed ideas about who you should be, what you should want, how you should feel, what should motivate you. The very lens through which you perceived meaning begins to reveal itself as a lens, not the truth of what you are, but simply one possible way of organizing the infinite complexity of conscious experience into a manageable narrative. And when that lens cracks, when its constructed nature becomes apparent, when you can see around its edges to the vast mystery it was designed to contain and domesticate, everything filtered through that lens suddenly appears questionable, provisional, potentially illusory. I want to pause for a moment and ask you directly, when was the moment you realized that everything you had been taught to want, everything you had been conditioned to pursue, everything that society told you would bring fulfillment, suddenly felt empty and meaningless? That instant when you looked at your life and felt like you were watching someone else's movie, going through the motions of a script you had never consciously chosen to perform? I know this experience can be profoundly disorienting and frightening. You look at your friends and family still enthusiastically pursuing their goals, still finding joy in their achievements, still motivated by their dreams, and you wonder, what has happened to you? Why can't you feel excited about the promotion, the relationship, the vacation, the purchase that once would have filled you with anticipation? Why does everything feel so hollow, so artificial, so ultimately pointless? I want you to know that this emptiness is not a disease but a doorway, that your experience of meaninglessness is actually consciousness, beginning to make space for a meaning so vast that it cannot coexist with the smaller meanings you once found sufficient. And that's why I'd like to invite you to share a fragment of your experience in the comments below. You can simply copy this phrase and complete it. I realized my old life felt meaningless when. By doing this, you not only validate your own experience of this profound transition, but you also reach out to someone else who might be watching this feeling like they are the only person in the world questioning the very point of existence. Your comment might be exactly the reassurance someone needs to understand that this dark passage is not the end of the journey, but its deepest beginning. This community of souls in transition, scattered across the world, grows stronger every time we acknowledge the courage it takes to question everything. Now, let's continue exploring what lies beyond this apparent destruction of the will to live. The terror of this phase often stems from the deeply ingrained belief that meaning is something that exists outside of ourselves, something we find in the world rather than something we participate in creating moment by moment. Through the very act of conscious engagement, we are conditioned to believe that purpose is something we discover rather than something we embody, that significance is something we achieve rather than something we express. When the external structures of meaning begin to collapse like dominoes in an earthquake, when the inherited purposes no longer resonate with the frequency of who you are becoming, when the culturally prescribed definitions of success and fulfillment reveal their arbitrary and often destructive nature, consciousness can feel like it is floating in an infinite void with no reference points, no coordinates, no way of determining which direction leads toward meaning and which toward further emptiness. But this void is not empty in the way we imagine emptiness to be. It is not the absence of content but the presence of infinite potential waiting to be actualized through conscious choice rather than unconscious conditioning. It is pregnant with possibilities so vast that they cannot be contained within the narrow definitions of purpose that society provides as ready-made templates for a meaningful life. The will to live that appears to have been destroyed was actually a will to live according to someone else's definition of what life should be about, someone else's map of what constitutes a journey worth taking. The death you are experiencing is the death of the borrowed self, the conditioned self, the self that was constructed from the expectations and projections of family, culture, media, education, and every other system designed to produce functional citizens rather than conscious beings. What begins to emerge from this apparent destruction is something far more authentic and ultimately far more powerful than anything that preceded it. It is the birth of a will to live that arises from your own direct, unmediated encounter with the mystery of existence rather than from inherited beliefs about what existence should provide in order to justify itself. This new motivation does not depend on external validation because it recognizes that consciousness itself is the source of all value. It does not require the approval of society because it understands that society is itself a collection of unconscious agreements rather than a repository of wisdom. It does not need to fit into predetermined categories of meaning and purpose because it recognizes that authentic meaning always transcends and includes whatever categories attempt to contain it. It emerges from the recognition that consciousness itself is the most extraordinary phenomenon in the known universe, that the sheer fact of aware experience existing at all is so inherently miraculous that it renders all questions about whether life is meaningful not just irrelevant but absurd. You are not separate from this consciousness, but are one of its infinite unique expressions, a singular and unrepeatable way that the universe has developed of knowing itself. The very fact that awareness exists, that experience is possible, that beauty can be perceived, that love can be felt, that understanding can dawn, that creativity can flow, that wonder can arise, becomes a source of motivation so profound that it needs no justification beyond itself. The paradox of this transition is that in order to find authentic meaning, consciousness must first pass through what appears to be absolute meaninglessness. It is only by releasing all borrowed purposes, all inherited definitions of what makes life worth living, all external authorities on what should provide fulfillment, that space is created for purpose to arise organically from the deepest levels of your being. The caterpillar does not become a butterfly by trying harder to be a better caterpillar, by improving its crawling technique, by accumulating more leaves, or by comparing itself to other caterpillars. It surrenders completely to a process of dissolution that appears from the outside to be death itself, trusting in a wisdom deeper than its caterpillar mind can comprehend. In the cocoon, there is no caterpillar, and there is not yet a butterfly. There is only what biologists call imaginal soup, a kind of primordial chaos of undifferentiated cells containing the template for a completely different form of life, waiting for the mysterious intelligence that governs metamorphosis to organize this apparent chaos into unprecedented beauty and capability. This is precisely what consciousness experiences during the dark night of awakening. The old form of self has dissolved into its constituent elements, but the new form has not yet crystallized into recognizable patterns. In this liminal space, this threshold between worlds, it can feel like nothing exists, like nothing matters, like there is no organizing principle capable of creating meaning from the fundamental randomness of existence. But this emptiness is actually fullness disguised, potential masquerading as void, infinite creative power appearing temporarily as powerlessness. It is the pregnant pause before a new octave of being announces itself through thoughts you have never thought, feelings you have never felt, perceptions you have never perceived, motivations arising from depths you never knew you contained. The meaninglessness you experience is not the absence of meaning, but the presence of a meaning so vast, so multidimensional, so far beyond anything your previous self could have imagined, that it cannot be contained within the small containers of purpose that once seemed sufficient. It is like trying to pour an ocean into a teacup. The ocean does not fit, but this does not mean the ocean does not exist. Your consciousness is beginning to sense meanings and purposes and reasons for existence that are so much larger than anything you previously imagined that they cannot squeeze themselves into the narrow definitions of fulfillment you once accepted. The loneliness of this passage cannot be understated or rationalized away through spiritual platitudes. When you are in the midst of questioning the very foundations of existence, when the activities that animate everyone around you feel hollow and artificial, when you can no longer participate in the collective unconsciousness with the same enthusiasm and conviction, when even pretending to care about the things that everyone else seems to care about feels like a betrayal of something sacred awakening within you, you can feel profoundly isolated not just from others, but from your own past self. Friends and family members who once felt like companions on the journey suddenly seem to be speaking a different language, living in a different reality, motivated by concerns that feel increasingly foreign and sometimes almost incomprehensible. They worry about things you can no longer bring yourself to worry about, things that seem so trivial in comparison to the fundamental questions of existence that you cannot understand how they continue to command such passionate attention. They get excited about achievements, acquisitions, and experiences that leave you feeling not just empty, but confused about how these things ever seemed important. They find meaning in pursuits that now strike you as elaborate forms of distraction from the only questions that actually matter. Who am I really? What is this consciousness that I am? Why does anything exist at all? What is my authentic relationship to the mystery of being? This isolation is both temporary and necessary, though knowing it is temporary does little to ease the profound loneliness it can generate. It is the natural result of consciousness moving between worlds, no longer fully inhabiting the reality it once called home, but not yet fully established in the reality it is moving toward. Like a person learning a new language who finds themselves temporarily unable to express complex thoughts in either their native tongue or their new language, consciousness in transition can find itself in a space where the old ways of making meaning no longer work, but the new ways have not yet fully developed into reliable sources of purpose and direction. This can manifest as a kind of existential muteness, an inability to explain to yourself or others what you are experiencing, because the experience itself is pointing toward realities for which there are not yet adequate words, concepts, or frameworks. You find yourself living in a space between stories, between identities, between worlds, and this betweenness can feel like homelessness of the most profound kind. Not just homelessness from place or people, but homelessness from meaning itself, from any coherent sense of who you are or what you are supposed to be doing with this mysterious gift of conscious existence. But in this apparent isolation, something profound is happening. Consciousness is learning to find its center not in external validation or inherited meaning, but in its own direct encounter with the mystery of being. It is developing what we might call ontological independence, the capacity to exist and find purpose, not because of what others tell you life should be about, but because of what you discover life is actually about when you encounter it directly and without mediation. This independence is not selfishness or narcissism. It is the emergence of authentic individuation, the birth of a self that is truly itself, rather than a collection of borrowed identities and inherited purposes. The practical wisdom that emerges from this passage is both simple and profound. Learn to distinguish between the will to live according to external definitions and the will to live according to your own deepest recognition of what existence offers. The former depends on constant validation from outside sources and will inevitably lead to disappointment because it is based on the impossible task of finding meaning in what others think you should find meaningful. The latter arises spontaneously when consciousness recognizes its own extraordinary nature and begins to live from that recognition rather than from borrowed beliefs about what it should be seeking. This does not mean abandoning all external engagement or retreating into solipsistic self-absorption. It means learning to engage with the world from a place of inner fullness rather than inner emptiness, from authenticity rather than conformity, from chosen response rather than conditioned reaction. When the will to live arises from your own direct encounter with the mystery of consciousness rather than from inherited scripts about what consciousness should be doing, it becomes unshakable because it is rooted in something real rather than something imagined. The great secret that begins to reveal itself as you move through this passage is that existence itself is meaningful independent of any particular meaning you might assign to it. The sheer fact that anything exists at all, that awareness is possible, that beauty emerges, that love flows, that understanding dawns, is so inherently remarkable that it needs no additional justification. The will to live that seemed to disappear was actually a will to live up to external expectations. The will to live that emerges is a will to participate in the extraordinary gift of existence itself, not because it provides anything in particular, but because participating in consciousness is inherently worthwhile. From this perspective, every moment becomes a form of worship. Every experience becomes a form of exploration. Every interaction becomes a form of communion with the fundamental mystery that expresses itself as existence. The goals and purposes that once seemed so important either fall away entirely or transform into vehicles for this deeper engagement. Career becomes a way of offering your unique gifts to the collective human experience. Relationships become opportunities for consciousness to know itself through communion with other expressions of consciousness. Creative pursuits become ways of allowing the mystery to express itself through your particular combination of awareness and capability. Trust the process of dissolution you are experiencing, even when every instinct screams that dissolution equals death. even when the absence of familiar motivations feels like the absence of life itself. Trust that what feels like the death of meaning is actually the birth of meaning so vast, so authentic, so rooted in the fundamental nature of consciousness itself, that it cannot be contained within the small vessels of borrowed purpose you once thought were sufficient. Trust that the emptiness you feel is not the absence of purpose, but the presence of a purpose so fundamental, so all-encompassing, so intimately connected to the very fact of your existence that it transcends all particular purposes while including and blessing them all. What emerges from this apparent destruction is not just a restoration of the will to live, but the birth of a will to live so profound, so authentic, so rooted in the direct recognition of what existence actually offers, rather than what you think it should offer, that it becomes a source of strength not just for yourself but for everyone whose life you touch. This new will to live does not need to be maintained through constant effort, because it arises naturally from your recognition of consciousness as the most extraordinary gift imaginable. It does not need to be defended against doubt, because it is based not on belief but on direct experience of the mystery that you are. From this transformed perspective, life becomes not a problem to be solved but a mystery to be lived, not a test to be passed but a gift to be received, not a burden to be carried but a dance to be danced. The very fact that you exist, that you are conscious, that you are capable of experiencing beauty and love and wonder and understanding, becomes so inherently meaningful that the question of whether life has meaning transforms into gratitude, that meaning has life, that consciousness has found a way to know itself through your unique and irreplaceable perspective. If these reflections on the dissolution and rebirth of meaning have touched something deep within you, if they have helped you recognize that your own dark night of the soul is not spiritual failure but spiritual labor, know that you are not alone in this passage between worlds. This path of questioning everything, of allowing the old forms of purpose to die so that authentic purpose can be born, of walking through the valley of apparent meaninglessness to reach the peaks of authentic engagement, can feel impossibly lonely when those around you have not yet been called to this depth of inquiry or transformation. It is precisely for this reason that we have created this sanctuary, this gathering place for consciousness in transition, this refuge for souls brave enough to let everything they thought they knew about meaning die, so that what they actually know about meaning can be born. By subscribing to this channel, you become part of a hidden community of beings who understand that sometimes meaning must be destroyed before it can be reborn, that sometimes the will to live must die before it can be resurrected in a form so authentic, so unshakable, so rooted in truth rather than conditioning, that it needs no external validation or maintenance. Each exploration we share is like a lighthouse beam cutting through the fog of this transition, offering perspective on how to navigate the dissolution without losing faith in what lies beyond it, how to endure the emptiness without mistaking it for the destination, how to trust the process even when the process feels like annihilation. We are not here to offer false comfort or premature answers to questions that must be lived rather than solved, problems that must be transformed rather than fixed, mysteries that must be entered rather than understood. We are here to hold space for the profound disorientation that accompanies genuine awakening, to validate the courage it takes to question everything, to remind you again and again that what feels like spiritual death is actually spiritual birth, what appears to be the end of meaning is actually its beginning. If you find yourself unable to participate in the collective unconsciousness with the same enthusiasm, if you question not just what you are doing but why anything is worth doing at all, if you feel like a stranger in the world that once felt like home, this channel is your refuge and your reminder that awakening is not a disease but a destiny. Subscribe and allow yourself to be accompanied through this passage by reflections that honor both the terror and the wonder of consciousness awakening to its own true nature. Together we form an invisible network of beings in transition, each moving at their own pace through the dissolution of borrowed meaning, toward the discovery of authentic purpose, each learning in their own way how to live from essence rather than personality, from truth rather than conditioning, from love rather than fear. A simple click of subscription is a quiet acknowledgement that you too are willing to let everything you thought you knew about meaning die, so that what you actually know about meaning can be born. And in a world that often pathologizes the very questioning that leads to authentic awakening, that medicates the very emptiness that precedes authentic fullness, that tries to fix the very dissolution that enables authentic creation, this recognition is a profound gift to both yourself and to everyone who will benefit from your emergence into authentic being, your resurrection into real life, your rebirth into the magnificent mystery that you have always been, but are only now beginning to. Remember,